Welcome to the Brain Fix podcast, discussing all things brain. I'm Dr. Nina Milosavljevic, lecturer in neuroscience at the University of Manchester, and our guest on the podcast today is Emma Robinson. Emma Robinson is professor of psychopharmacology at the University of Bristol, and she is a world-leading expert in developing animal models of emotional behavior, which is very crucial to study the cause and treatment of psychiatric conditions, where emotional changes are obviously a very important aspect. And today we'll be discussing a very popular topic of psychedelics. Welcome, Emma, to the podcast. Could we start with a little background into your research career and what drew you specifically to this area of psychopharmacology?
Yeah, so I found psychopharmacology really interesting when I was an undergraduate student. So we were taught all about serotonergic mechanisms in the brain. And I think the biggest thing for me was realising at this moment that actually there was so much that wasn't known. And when you're going to your final year and you've been studying from textbooks and everything's fact, to then realise that actually there's so many unknowns is really exciting. I like the brain, I like behaviour. And so for me, the perfect career was to look at how drugs affect the brain, which is, of course, psychopharmacology. I spent about 5 years working in teaching in the university before ultimately settling to my career in the research, particularly with a focus on emotional behaviour in animals. That was my area of interest, and major depressive disorder. So looking at how antidepressants are acting in the brain, trying to understand the mechanisms behind antidepressants, and then being able to develop new treatments. And of course, that's led us most recently into the world of psychedelics.
Oh, excellent. So animal models are often crucial in understanding psychiatric disorders and developing treatments, as I'm sure you very well agree with. Could you elaborate a bit more on the specific challenges that researchers face when using these models to replicate very complex human emotional and psychiatric conditions?
Yeah, this has certainly been the focus of my research. So the big challenge when studying psychiatric disorders is that the way we understand them in humans is very much based on what people report, their personal experience of their illness. So these symptoms are subjective, they're subjective self-reported measures. And broadly, we don't use objective methods like you would if you were studying hypertension or diabetes. You have something that you measure in people that is objective. In psychiatry, it's based on symptoms like how do you feel, how's your mood, what do you feel about rewarding activities, and these are the ways that we diagnose depression. If you then try and think about how would you model that in an animal, then to some extent you're always going to have to anthropomorphize. You have to say something about some interpretation of what that would look like in an animal. So we test things like, would an animal be more likely to give up in a situation which it couldn't escape from? Would an animal be less likely to keep its coat clean and tidy? But those aren't very specific. In fact, they're really quite general. So up until very recently, it's been very much about what we think depression looks like in an animal rather than being able to directly relate it to what we see in humans. So I think that what makes studying psychiatry so complicated is it isn't well defined in humans, so how can you then define it well in animals? We don't yet know what causes psychiatric disorders in humans, so we have no real method to manipulate our animal model to generate depression-like states. And then our readouts are based on trying to say, what does a subjective symptom in a human look like when you're trying to measure it in an animal?
Right. So, but like in your work, you've studied some of these behavioral effects of substances in animal models, and you actually made some breakthroughs how emotional changes actually can be measured in animal models. So can you tell us a bit more about that, and also how reliable then these measures are in translating to human behaviors and conditions?
Yeah, so there are people who are doing research in human studies where they are not relying just on subjective self-report, but they actually use computer tests which look at different types of behaviours, so different aspects of cognition or emotional behaviour in people, and those are done objectively. So what we did is we looked to see what in the literature is being done in humans, and it turns out that there's a really interesting phenomenon that occurs in depression, which is a thing called a negative bias. So this is when the world is sort of processed in a more negative way, and that affects all sorts of things that we do, how we make decisions. It's that sort of optimism, pessimism idea, but also learning and memory. So when you have a bad day, how you remember things is influenced by those experiences, not just that experience of the bad experience, but also influences other things you experience in that day. So we took that idea, and we knew that it could be objectively measured in people, mostly using things like memory of words or interpreting emotional faces. But we took that idea and we said, okay, can we ask rats if they can learn about two different things under two different emotional, or rodents we call it affective state, and then we could ask them which would they prefer. And we could work out from their preference, their choices, whether we had generated a more positive emotional or affective state or a more negative affective state. And that's really been the basis of the work that we do. We generate biased memories, and those biases are created by the affective state or the emotion of the animal, and then we can look at how that interacts with important parts of their neural circuitry, or how it interacts with drugs that might be antidepressant.
And I'm very obviously interested in antidepressants, and I think in that field, psychedelics are being like a very hot topic recently. But for some of our listeners, the science may not be entirely clear. So could you explain what psychedelics are and what makes them different from other classes of substances?
So psychedelics have been around for, humans have been using psychedelic substances for as long as probably our history. We know that plants produce psychedelic substances. And what a psychedelic is, the ones we're particularly talking about are called serotonergic psychedelics. They change consciousness, they change perception, they change the way that our brain processes information. And they do it in such a way that humans seem to like. And that's why people have been using them as part of rituals. People can see different, have different experiences, and that has important ritual or can have religious meaning for people. And more recently, so in our recent history, psychedelics were used in the 60s, 70s as substances to facilitate psychotherapy. So people they were used in America and in the UK to help in the treatment of psychiatric disorders. And then because they became illegal for complicated reasons, but they were banned and research became almost impossible, they couldn't be used clinically, they were banned from a research point of view, there was very little done. And then that all changed fairly recently when interest sort of was reawakened. Some small-scale trials were done in patients with what we call treatment-resistant depression. They hadn't responded to current therapies. And these drugs showed that they seemed to be effective. And there were some really exciting observations, and that was that they worked quickly, very quickly, within a few hours, days, and that their effects were long-lasting. So one treatment, one psychedelic experience seemed to be enough to last a very long time. And that opened up a whole new avenue from a research point of view, not just researching whether these psychedelics were going to be the next generation of treatments for disorders like depression, maybe anxiety, maybe other psychiatric conditions, but more importantly for me as a basic scientist, they gave us a window into how the brain processes information and something that we could probe the circuits that perhaps are very important for emotional behaviour. And so you've kind of touched upon this, but there has been a resurgence of interest in the potential therapeutic use of psychedelics even now, right? And so do you think psychedelics could eventually play a role in treating psychiatric disorders, as you said, like depression, anxiety? And what research is supporting this idea? So I certainly think that from what we've seen at the moment, the psychedelics are a very exciting new sort of avenue for treating psychiatric disorders, particularly depression. That's the area that there's been the most research, I would say, and also most interest. They have been used in clinical trials, and those clinical studies are showing effects. And this year and into next year, we will get the first data from a properly controlled, large-scale clinical trial in treatment-resistant depression. Once we have that, I think we will then really have a better idea about where the future sits with these treatments. There'll be much more safety information and more idea about how to use them. And they'll start to be, there's been some small-scale trials in other psychiatric conditions as well. So we'll see them used, I think, a bit more tested, a bit more in PTSD and anxiety.
Mm-hmm. And what do we know from animal studies? Do we have any kind of more mechanistical information which could kind of relate to human and clinical applications?
Yeah, so the clinical side of it's quite challenging because they're such powerful drugs and they have such powerful effect. There's been a lot of questions over whether they're having a genuine effect or it's an exaggerated placebo response, maybe because people have high expectations and you can't control for a psychedelic experience. It is just a very powerful. So animal studies gives us an opportunity to ask questions about what do they do in the brain and how might they interact with processes that are relevant to. And that's where we come back to work like ours with the affective biases, where we've been able to show that actually there's a very specific mechanism that we think is involved in the generation of negative affective states, so low mood in depression, and that same circuit seems to be directly modulated by psychedelics in a very specific way. And that's the focus of our research, is now to try to identify the mechanisms, not just from the psychedelic perspective, but actually going downstream from that. Can we find other ways? Because ultimately the goal would be that we could find a treatment that isn't a psychedelic, that doesn't need people to be in hospital, that could just work through a similar mechanism in terms of treating the disease, but be given sort of a tablet every day or something more aligned with the conventional approach we take to treating psychiatric disorders. There's very different views on that. Some people think that the psychedelic experience is critical to the antidepressant effect. Some people think that it's very important for people to have a sort of mystical experience, and that correlates with how effective the drug treatment will be. I think animal studies are very interesting in that they don't probably have that. They're not having oceanic boundlessness or mystical experiences as is described by humans. And we are able to see in them anyway that there is this very specific modulation of an affective bias circuit. And maybe that is the critical part.
And I think that's probably one of the most interesting parts about psychedelics in kind of, let's say, basic research, right, is to try to identify the circuits that drive these affective biases, because we don't know much about it, do we? I mean, we kind of do to some extent, but I suppose we don't know really what the circuits are of depression or affective bias or any of these, right? It's still there's still a lot of unknowns.
No, we don't know. We don't know what causes depression. We have some insight from brain imaging of bits of brain area that are possibly involved, but it's very hard to study in people. We can't do causal studies. It's not ethical. We also, what we have with patients may have been on many different medications. Very, very difficult to get to the bottom of that. So, yeah, it will, of course, depend to some extent on how much affective biases are the critical part of this. I think there is good evidence, and probably some of the strongest evidence, that this is a behavioural biomarker of the disease, and therefore knowing the mechanisms and being able to target those selectively could give us better treatments. And certainly that's where the animal models will be very useful in helping us identify possible circuits, potential drug targets within those circuits that will achieve what we're seeing with psychedelics, but perhaps without some of the other effects.
And I guess one of the questions that probably is going to be interesting for our audience and for the general public is that there is this stigma around the psychedelics that's been traditionally carried. So how do you think the scientific community and the public will react to their potential role in mental health treatment? And what do we need to understand before psychedelics become part of mainstream therapy? And do you think they would ever become one?
I think there's certainly everything is pointed towards potentially, psychedelics could be the next generation of treatments, but I think they will always be for those that have the most severe illness. I would be surprised if they would come into sort of more of the general psychiatric care. They're very powerful drugs. It's going to be expensive because of the care that goes with treating people with this. So I think there's going to be limits. In terms of stigma, I think that's a real challenge for any of these is that we want patients to feel confident in having these treatments. And there is a lot of history with psychedelics that I'm sure will impact on people. Hopefully, when you start to bring together well-controlled studies done by legitimate organisations with, properly done statistics and everything, alongside robust basic science that supports and shows that these are having real effects on brain mechanisms that are important, I would hope that together will bring confidence to the field, both in terms of getting drugs licensed for use, but also in then giving patients confidence to undergo these treatments. What would I predict? I think there'll be a period of time when these will be the main treatment for patients who haven't responded to others, but I would very much hope that they will just be a stepping stone. And I think that's the key here, is these are a stepping stone. They're an insight into the brain, they're insight into mechanisms important in the disease. And if we can work them out by using these as a sort of reference, we should get something, hopefully, that works a lot better.
Oh, great. Thanks so much, Emma, for coming on the podcast and sharing your insights. I think it was really great to hear how the field, and obviously you played a big role in this field to bring animal models in more kind of translational applications and really trying to understand the mechanisms that are present in psychiatric disorders, and understanding the affective bias, which is important aspect of these, and then again how the therapy goes in the whole concept, and especially the more hot topic as psychedelics. So thanks so much for coming today, Emma. It's been a pleasure to have you here. This has been the Brain Fix podcast. Any feedback on this or future content or sponsorship inquiries, please send to the DNS inbox, dns@manchesterac.uk, with podcast in the subject line. Tune in next time for more neuroscience.